Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright. I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
And we have joining us today the great, the late, I was about to say late and great.
Don't say late great, dude.
We have the magnanimous Dr. Samuel Perry, who is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity, American politics. He's the author of a bunch of books that you all should be reading, Taking America Back for God, The Flag and the Cross, and he's out with a new book now called Religion for Realists, Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion. And we are just so happy to have you join us. Sam, how's it going?
Hey, it's my pleasure to be here, guys. Really, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's such a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, sure. So just so our audience knows, it was kind of funny. We were just sort of ruminating and reminiscing before we hit record. We're like, man, we should probably just hit the record button. So like, we're going to try our best to kind of pick up where we left before we actually like started hitting record. So like, how are you feeling, Sam? It is post-election day, and Sam is feeling fill in the blank.
You know, I had anticipated that this was, based on polling. I mean, it was neck and neck, and so I think I was already preparing myself. I wasn't going to have a 2016 thing happen in my my spirit again. So I was pretty much kind of geared up for like, hey, this is very much so a reality. He's already this far. Why not? This is certainly possible. And looking back, like, there's actually a lot of signs in political science that people are kind of pointing to that like really should have clued in that this was probably going to be the eventual outcome. But, I would have much preferred, cards on the table, I would have preferred a different outcome than Trump being the president again. I don't think that's going to be very good. But, for a couple of reasons, I'm not. My grieving phase was about 5 minutes after I figured like, okay, this is definitely going to happen now. Kind of sat with that for a second and then decided for a variety of reasons, here's how we need to pursue it. One, I've already, like, my wife back in 2016 or 2017 got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she's fine today, clear scans. But for that 2 weeks, it was the worst 2 weeks of my life. It was the worst news I've ever gotten in my life, and not, compared to that 2 weeks, no bad news, short of losing my own child, no bad news on earth could ever match that. And so like political, whoever's in office just does not compare to that kind of bad news. So I'm a little bit ruined for bad news. You know what I mean? Like I'm already kind of over a lot of whatever politically could happen. And so moving on from that though, like there's a variety of reasons I think both the right and the left should not take the results as either a full-throated endorsement of what they were believing or a full-throated rejection of it. So here's an example. So over the past couple of days, we were talking about before we started rolling that you've heard both lamenting on the left about, hey, the world is going to end, it's over, and on the right, like, hey, this is time to spike the football, and this is just going to be great. Obviously, this is a endorsement of everything that we believe and want. Really, in hindsight, I think all of the political scientists and the data that we have on how this election turned out the way it did was one, economic frustrations and a low rating to an incumbent, like an incumbent president. And Harris was associated with Biden, who was rated really low as the president.
Yeah.
And statistically speaking, you have an uphill battle if you have a low rating president. If you're a part of that incumbent party, and the economy is in bad shape, and it's actually not in bad shape, but inflation hurts, and I'm having to pay over $10 for my Chick-fil-A now, and that's really frustrating, and I don't like that. And so I get it. Like, people really felt the pinch of like inflation, even though economic numbers are quite good. Democrats lost the vibe war, right? Like that's Republicans were able to kind of convince more that like, hey, this is in bad shape, and it's Biden's fault. Harris got a part of that. So you've got this economic story that's really driving this. You've also got what's going on globally right now, which is incumbents around the world. Incumbent parties are all losing, and they are being replaced by out of office parties who are promising kind of the fix of a global inflation that's happening. So in a sense, Harris was kind of doomed from the start. No, I mean, again, hindsight's 2020, and it looked like she had all of this momentum, but I think there were a lot of indicators to suggest that this is an economic story. This is about rejecting the incumbent parties everywhere, and people feeling like this is what we want. We need change, despite whatever Trump represents. So that being said, I because we have all of these ballot measures, like I mean, I'm sure you guys were following this, all of these ballot measures that took place in states that Trump won. For example, 7 out of 9 ballot measures for abortion rights won, and 5 out of 7 of those were in Trump states, right? In 3 out of 3 ballot measures that were going for charter schools, which is a conservative issue, were rejected, and 2 out of 3 of those were Trump states. People were voting for things like paid sick leave. People were voting for things like raising the minimum wage, all in Trump states, right? So these are left-looking kind of like moral and economic kind of wins, but they're happening in states that Trump won. So this suggests to me that it's not about like all of a sudden people on the left are kind of like, hey, everybody's a racist and a Christian nationalist and a fascist now. What kind of country am I in? I actually don't think the signs are necessarily pointing to that. I think there's signs pointing to people were really frustrated economically and they needed change and they wanted that. And the Democrats weren't promising that to a working class population. The Democrats are now increasingly the party statistically, and you can go online and see these stats yourself. Statistically, they are now the party of the educated elite and the income elite this election in terms of like who turned out. And that's an incredible flip, right? Like that's an incredible turn of events. But that's how Democrats were, I think portrayed, and Kamala Harris didn't do anything to dissuade Americans from that. So people on the right should not crow that all of a sudden, I mean, they got the results they want, and so they can actually like influence things in a lot of ways. So like they absolutely should feel like, hey, we have an opportunity, because they do. But I don't think they should necessarily take this as like, hey, Hispanics love us, and they're all Christian nationalists now, or hey, we're, all of these working class people are now kind of like trad Catholics and evangelicals and conservatives who want to do everything that we want to do. I don't think that's necessarily the case, if that makes sense. So like that makes me feel like a couple of things. And I'm sorry I'm dominating the conversation, but I think a couple of things are going on. Like I think if Donald Trump is the same Donald Trump as he was in 2016 to 2020, which was primarily a pretty lazy and distracted president. Like he accomplished some things and got some things through, but mostly was like he's a showman, doesn't like to be contained, doesn't like to stay on kind of track with any kind of things. If that's the same kind of Donald Trump, I mean, best case scenario, because he does what he does, and then the midterms roll around in 2026, and if literally like 95% of midterms are any indication, like, and I mean historically, 95% of midterms shift Congress to the out of office party. That would point to one of the reasons like Democrats were kind of celebrating in 2022 is they thought they were going to get destroyed in 2022 in the midterms, and they only lost a couple of seats, and they were taking that as a victory. And so if you see kind of a huge reaction to Trump in 2026, then that means he gets boxed in, and his ability to kind of ram things through is limited. But the next 2 years are probably going to be pretty tough for anybody on the Democratic side who feels like threatened by the kinds of things that he's promising now.
So what do you think about, I love what you just said. It's very insightful, just thinking about, yeah, you're right. I should look at the whole picture, because so often people just look at, hey, who won the presidency? But then you look at the House, you look at the Senate, you look at measures and governors. And it does seem like there's a pretty handy red wave, I guess that's what they call it, in those areas. And yet at the same time, what does that actually tell us? And I would love for you to help us figure out, how do we temper our assumptions when we see all these things? Because you just named a few things, but how do you work through, help us get into the mind of Sam Perry in terms of how do you work through, yeah, I'm seeing this data, but this data needs to be interpreted. And I'm going to try to figure out not just what my first assumption is about this data and what it's saying. How do you dig a little deeper? How do you kind of take a step back and just not let your initial narrative that your brain gives you be the one that drives the show?
Yeah, so I'll walk you through how I did this with my students yesterday. So in my social problems class, I teach a large 100-person social problems class where we just talked about the election, and I wanted to help them think through what just happened and why did we see the results we did. And so I took various theories that were like projected out there on Twitter, hot takes about, either from the right or the left about, hey, you've got one group of people that says, hey, let's be honest, half the country is racist and misogynist, and they're courting fascism. Then you've got another side on the right that says, hey, the MSNBC liberal elites can spin this however they want to, but what you've got now is a full-throated rejection or a repudiation of wokeness and liberal ideals. And so what I did was I looked through all of the polling data, all of the exit polls in comparison to previous years and the shifts that we're witnessing and the things that we're seeing around the world. And I wanted to test those theories. So if we are saying, and that's what you do is as a social scientist, you take, okay, what is the theory? What is the claim you're making? Is this a sign that America has just veered into racism and misogyny? And do the polls reflect that? Well, I think you have a tough argument to make there if the largest swings were towards Trump were among Hispanics and Black people and Asian people and young people and lower income people and a lot of women, right? Like, and not college educated women, they're the only group, but like most women on average went towards Trump this time, and they didn't show up for Democrats like they thought. That doesn't mean those people can't be racist and misogynist, but it makes it a tougher argument if you're going to say that like this is all that's been driving that shift, right? Like most Republicans vote Republicans, most Democrats vote Democrat. Like its party is the primary, by a large margin, is the primary thing that drives you to vote however you do. But after that, those people who are movable in the middle, it doesn't seem to be like Trump just kind of swept people up in this kind of rhetoric of marginalizing the other or hatred. It seems like the people that we looked at who were shifted are young people who are probably concerned about their economic futures. And lower income minorities who, like Black and Hispanic Americans, who have been peeling off from the Democratic Party for the last few elections, right? Like that's not a new thing. They're not becoming Republicans, but they're becoming more independent. In other words, they're in play politically. And that's what they were this time. So the theory, when you look at it with the data, the theory that like, hey, let's just be honest, most Americans just got really racist all of a sudden or misogynist, that doesn't really hold true. And let's look at the other thing. Are you going to say that, hey, MSNBC News can take this as a repudiation of wokeness and liberal ideals? Well, that doesn't explain all those ballot measures. That doesn't explain how governors in Arizona who, that went for Trump lost. Carrie Lake lost. A bunch of MAGA-like Republicans lost. And a lot of Republicans picked up seats, but a lot of MAGA Republicans lost. And so it doesn't really, neither one of those theories really explains it. What does explain it better is the idea that this is like, this happens typically when economic frustrations are high, and this is happening all over the world. And there is it's what I call a vibe war. So like there's, and this is how I explain it to my students, like whether or not this is true or not, and I don't think most of this is true. The idea that immigrants are dangerous and they're pouring into the country and they're coming with crime, and that the economy is in tatters and it's shambles and it's all Biden's fault. I don't think either of those things are necessarily true, or not even necessarily true. They're just not true. Like undocumented immigrants and regular immigrants or documented immigrants are lower crime risks than native-born Americans, right? You have more to fear from a native-born Texan than you have from an undocumented or documented immigrant in Texas, statistically speaking, right? So the idea that immigrants bring crime is wrong, but the vibe war is like, hey, immigrants bring crime, and a lot of Americans felt that. They're very fearful of that. You've also got the idea of the economy being bad. The economy is actually really in good shape. The stock market's up, and unemployment is down. We have a strong economy. We've bounced back from COVID faster than any other nation, any other developed country. But inflation sucks, and it hurts, and like we are all feeling that with housing prices and gas and food and whatever. And so it's really easy to win that vibe war for Republicans and just say, look, don't you hate it? Like, don't you hate paying that much money for eggs and milk and those things? Yeah, I feel that. And so successfully, if you're able to win that vibe war and send out that messaging, and Democrats haven't been. Kamala Harris, if you look at, I can't show it up on here, but if you look at Pew Research Center did a survey of what Americans were prioritizing in the vote in September. So like a month ago, or like a month and a half ago, and they showed what Americans were going to prioritize this in their vote, what they considered very important. And all of the issues that Trump ended up winning on, like economy and immigration and fear of violence or violent crime, are all near the top of what Americans were going to vote for. And all of the Democratic issues like climate, abortion, racial inequality are all at the bottom. And so, I mean, like, this should include like us into like, look, the kinds of things that Democrats were running for and prioritizing are not things most Americans were going to prioritize. And they didn't this election. So it's less of a battle of like ideological kind of conflict and more of just who was promising change and who was promising better economic futures, whether that's true or not. Republicans won that, and they did it across the board.
We all want money in our pocket, man. I mean, honestly, it makes sense. Go ahead.
Well, and it's something that the left has got to, like the intellect, let's say the intellectual left and the elite. I don't mean like anybody who votes Democrat, but let's just say the intellectual left. They really need to come to grips with this idea that like more Americans, Americans will first think, how do I put food on the table and a roof over my head before they start thinking about climate change, and before they start thinking about progressive values. If you take care of people's immediate needs, then they can start thinking about recycling. Then they can start thinking about, you know what, how do I become a more kind of like tolerant person? That's but good. Like, unless they have those things, they're just going to go for what they need, how they support their future and their families. And that's a fair thing to worry about.
Are you saying that like climate change isn't on that first level of my hierarchy of needs? Like,
right? Maybe it should be, but it's not.
Yeah, and this is one of those. It ends up coming across as kind of tone deaf, and the conservatives, I think, are also successful at kind of making an argument that so the way we even go about global climate change initiatives, the biggest polluters are the poorest countries. Right, they're the ones that really don't have time to think about, do I recycle? They're the ones just trying to put food on the table. It's India, it's China, it's all of these really like kind of like low income per capita regions, and they're huge polluters, right? Like, and they're just trying to get their economies going. Well, so the conservative argument has always been like, hey, rather you developed nations that are already rich, instead of putting a bunch of sanctions on these countries and trying to cap their emissions, like, why don't you help them develop economically? And then they will voluntarily try to reduce climate change. They don't want to live in filth. They don't want to live in dirty, smoggy air, but they got to be able to live, right? And this is like billions of people. So the conservative argument, one I feel like I'm kind of persuaded by, is the whole kind of, we absolutely need to address climate change. That's a good thing, and that's important. But the way we go about it has got to be tempered with an understanding that like economies need to develop, and they will eventually come along to adopt those kinds of progressive climate ideals when they can eat, you know?
Yeah, you know, number one, I really appreciate you reframing the results the way that you have, because I was thinking about this just today, how if Kamala Harris won, and won to the degree that Trump won this go around, popular vote, all these like Congress and whatnot, there would be news story after news story about the Americans' rebuke of, you know, authoritarianism.
Right. Like, yeah, that's right.
Which might be true for a lot of people, but it probably wouldn't necessarily be the thing that like gets people to the polls. Kind of to your point, like, I could care less about who wants to be an authoritarian as long as they can make sure I got food, you know, on my table or something like that. So I really appreciate just that framing, because I think that's going to help a lot of people. It's going to help me just process, you know, what the results mean, and hopefully, you know, as a Democrat, get my elected officials a little kick in the butt and say like, hey, you have forgotten about the people. You made a lot of promises, you know, like, I don't see James Clyburn out there, you know, campaigning a lot with Harris, like, and he secured the black vote for Biden, you know, so yeah, but I am curious though, like, how did the Christians do?
Well, so evangelicals did exactly what evangelicals do. I mean, it was like actually a mirror of 2016 and 2020. 81% of white evangelicals went for Trump. It wasn't not even a dent put in that number at all. For or against, right? Like it wasn't higher, wasn't lower. And which is just, I think that's just to kind of say evangelicals are now mostly Republicans, right? Like that's just kind of that's the Venn diagram of evangelical to Republican is eventually becoming a circle. What did change was Catholics. So Catholics, majority of Catholics went for Trump this time, but that was primarily, so if you actually look at the numbers there, that is a little bit driven by white Catholics, but it's mostly driven by Hispanic Catholics. So when you break that down to like, when you just pull out the white Catholics, like it's a much bigger shift. And to me, that suggests that it's not ideological necessarily for like Hispanic Catholics. I think it's more of like a working class kind of shift. Now there is like within the Christian movement, and this has been going on the last few years, political identities are now our primary sorting identities. Like we are as Americans organizing our religious identities, who is us and who is them, primarily under who is conservative and who is liberal, rather than like your views on soteriology. So it used to be, growing up as an evangelical, it used to be the understanding, this is around, like, let's just say around 2000, we would have said Catholics are not Christians, Mormons are not Christians, right, because they have a different view of salvation, right? Like they have a different view of, that would have been the theological dividing between them. But now, and conservative evangelicals absolutely would have said that, right? Like in 2010, 2011, I think Robert Jeffress called Catholics like a cult. Same with Mormons, right? Like, but Robert Jeffress now recognizes that, like, no, these guys are my allies, these are friends, you're close enough, right? Like you're Christian enough to be on team Christian, right? So, and what that is politics. And so what you see among Christians is you see a more porous kind of group membership ideal, right? Like, whereas we're no longer divided by soteriology or your views on biblical authority and how you want to weight those kinds of things. It's much more of a big tent if you are conservative versus progressive. The group that did not shift towards Trump was nuns. Non-religious people did not shift toward, unaffiliated people did not shift toward Trump. They actually became more, which is a polarizing thing, right? Like it's a polarization deal. So Christians moved further to Trump. Non-Christians or nuns moved further away. And other religious groups kind of stayed in the middle. I think Muslim Americans shifted a little bit towards Trump, maybe because of Palestine, which is bizarre. Like it's like that they would move towards Trump. Maybe it's a backlash to Biden, but that Muslims would think that Trump is your friend is kind of hilarious to me and sad. But that is kind of what has been happening with American religion is just further sorting.
Yeah, Sam, real quick, Sam, what's soteriology? It's a term I'm not familiar with.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. So soteriology just means your theology of salvation. I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. So your theology of whether it's salvation by grace alone, or grace plus works, or faith plus works, or being baptized and that kind of thing in the church or whatever. It's your theology of salvation used to divide evangelicals or Catholics or Mormons, but now not really. It's Trump, right? Like what it was, we found in a study recently. We published a study this year ago where we were. It was Pew Research Center, and they were asking how religious are various politicians, and they included Trump and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and those kinds of things. And what we found is that basically, if you were the party of that person, you thought they were very religious and more religious than the other candidates. And it also didn't matter whether you even knew what their religion was, because even people who didn't know whether Trump was a Christian or not thought he was more religious than Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. And so what it is, it's about in-group. It's about what, religious means you're part of my tribe, you're part of my crew. And that's shaped by partisan identity and ideological identity, whether you're conservative or liberal. And so I really mean, like, it's the boundaries of what it means to be a Christian. I posted this on Twitter the other day, and I really do mean it. No other time in my life has there been a wider gap between what I've always understood the word Christian to mean and what the word now means, like socially in public. Because it used to be, I swear, like, I don't feel like I'm the one who changed, right? Like I really don't. I feel like the Sam today at 44 is the Sam that was like at 24, who was working in college ministry and going to seminary and those kinds of things. I feel like I understood, if you told me you were a Christian, that meant I could expect certain things from you. Like I could expect how you view outsiders and non-Christians and how you to treat people, and, you know, a certain level of Christ-likeness that I would expect. And now you tell me you're a Christian, and I feel like it tells me almost nothing about how you treat people or what you you believe. I don't know, you know?
I mean, yeah, I definitely resonate with that deeply, Sam. I'm just like, I feel alone. And it's funny because I help a pastor do research. And one of the things that we were researching for an upcoming sermon was Jesus teaching when he has two disciples or two potential disciples. Well, one is a disciple, another one's a scribe. And they come to him and they say, hey, you know, teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go. And he says, hey, the foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And you're kind of like, what? Is Jesus saying I have to be homeless to be a Christian? And it's like, no. Like one of the things that's very clear, because he's about to take his disciples into Gentile territory. He's about to take his 12 into Gentile territory, cross over the Sea of Galilee, go, and they're going to confront this demon-possessed guy from near the Decapolis who's unclean and all these things. It's a story where they send him into all the pigs. If anyone, it's an amazing story. People should read it. No matter if you're Christian or not, it's just like, whoa, this is crazy stuff. But when looking at that, you're thinking, well, one thing that seems very clear as I look at this is that the more you know and love Jesus, the more of a political alien you're going to be. I don't know if that's the right word, but you're going to feel you're not going to feel at home in any political party because you're going to start to see that they're going to use the same kind of coercive ways of trying to make you believe them, use the same kind of rhetoric, just different content, but the same strategy to get you to comply.
Right.
And it's amazing to me how much we have just sold out, just completely sold out in the evangelical church to political power and completely away from what Jesus would have done and how he would have acted. And I just wanted to, I mean, you can give me any thoughts you have on what I just said, but I wanted to just get you to kind of help us understand, like you had this article that came out, right? I think it was with Josh Grubbs, of Christian Nationalism and Support for Leaders Violating Democratic Norms during National Emergencies.
Right.
And I think that's fascinating because this idea that Christians, they would all say they're Christian, and yet they're completely okay, it seems, maybe not completely, but they're much more comfortable with autocratic kind of, behavior from their leaders, strength, have to show strength, empire, Caesar, not really Jesus. What did you find there, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we did this study, and we ran the study after January 6th. A year or so after that, we were curious whether or not people and because we knew this anecdotally, we had seen on social media or in our own conversations, people just kind of justifying like, hey, you gotta crack some eggs to to make an omelet, and
yes,
and if people got to get hurt, that's just kind of what needs to happen to make this work. So we were just curious whether or not Christian nationalist ideology, the idea that the nation rightfully belongs to us and not them, and that we should take it back, and that we have a special relationship with God, and that should be defended or protected or promoted or privileged. We wanted to see whether or not those kinds of Americans who embrace that would be more likely to say, like, yeah, national leaders should be able to suspend elections if they need to, or to suppress their opponents if they need to, accomplish something, or if they need to, what else? Suspend elections, oppress opponents, suspend other kinds of norms or whatever. And that was the strongest predictor that Americans believe that kind of thing. But that's primarily because Christian nationalism, I mean, you can see this in anybody who actually owns the label. Like we know lots of people who embrace Christian nationalism who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christian nationalists. But really, the people who call themselves Christian nationalists are the best exemplars of the kind of thing that we're talking about. Because if you go online and you look at Andrew Torba or Stephen Wolfe or these people who are actually touting these ideologies, the people who are writing books about these kinds of things, these are the very people who would absolutely say, there are no enemies to the right, right? Like there's nobody who is too conservative. And if we have to, like, if Nazis are kind of for the things that we're for, then we need to kind of, not throw out the baby with the bathwater and just accept that we've got some common enemies, so we can just cooperate on this kind of thing. And it's that kind of thing. And I mean, look at the kind of rhetoric that you see from, I think, right-wing provocateurs who I think are also Christian nationalists, guys like Matt Walsh or others. These guys are unapologetically saying, like, look, you ought to be able to mock, provoke, lie to. I mean, that's been a big thing online right now, is like we should be able to lie to non-Christians if it means winning. That was a controversial thing a few weeks ago. A guy named Ben Crenshaw had a big out with Carl Trueman in the interwebs about, like, kind of whether or not Christians are justified in just lying to their enemies, kind of like basically with the idea that like, look, when I leave my house for a couple of days on vacation, I leave a few lights on to make burglars think that I'm there. And so if burglars don't deserve the truth, certainly my political enemies don't deserve the truth. So I should be able to, if I would lie to Nazis who come to my door looking for Jews that I'm hiding, then surely I can lie to a few libs in order to accomplish my political goals. And that's just the justification. So when you go down that road, though, then all you see is friends and enemies politically. And the people who are on your side are your friends. And that just means anybody who's conservative and not leftist. And that means you've eliminated all possibility of cooperation, all possibility. It's just defeat. It's just conquering. It's just war. And that's really what Christian nationalism is about, though, at its core. It's us versus them. And you have not only it's us versus them, but it's divine mandate for us versus them. It is God loves you, not them. And when you combine that with certain other kind of theologies, like more of a Pentecostal kind of cosmic battle between good and evil, end times eschatology and end times theology, is I think you're more likely to, I think, get a radicalization, violence even, because what isn't justified when your enemy is literally Satan.
That's so true. We had a clinical psychologist on our show who does stuff with politicians, and we were asking her all kinds of stuff about Christian nationalism and everything too. And she said almost the exact same thing you just said. You sort of get people to think that they're fighting a holy battle, and then you get them in community, and then it's just like, it's all downhill from there. But I'm more curious though about something you said earlier when you were talking about Christians, because this was something that Josh and I had talked about before we started recording. Like, do we need a new term to just be able to kind of separate the two theologies, ideologies? I don't know. And like, how does not having a broad term, affect polling and surveys and stuff like that? Like, if you were to poll a bunch of Christians, like all of us on this call would probably be in that poll, but like ostensibly we're probably not like the kind of Christians that we write about, talk about, or whatnot. So how does that work?
So that there actually really we'd benefit so much better from having some better terms, because like I think this, if you go on exit polls right now on NBC News or New York Times, they're just going to be these broad categories: Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, other minority religion, and nuns or unaffiliated. And then maybe they'll ask that other question, like, would you consider yourself a born again or evangelical Christian? But those are, that's a problematic. As Ryan Burge, who's a political scientist and a great follow on social media as well, he has a great Substack called Graphs About Religion, and is always putting out really good, I think, information. he has shown over time more and more people are identifying as evangelicals. And even people who are not Christians, even like Muslims, are identifying as evangelicals, and unaffiliated people identify as evangelicals. Because what that means is now like pro-religion Trump supporter or pro-religion conservative or Republicans, because they just kind of get the connotation of that word. Evangelical doesn't mean I have a born again relationship with like Jesus, that I've asked Jesus into my heart and he's my Lord and Savior. It means that I'm conservative, I'm pro-religion, I'm pro-Christian, I'm pro-Trump, and all of those things. And so we really do need better questions. I'm not sure, other than just kind of more religion questions to kind of break that down a little bit. Maybe theological questions, but I think even, I think Barna tries to get at this a little bit more. Like if you ever have read a Barna study, I think they try to divide it into categories like practicing Christian and practicing Bible, like they try to have different categories that are not just like I identify with this, but I go to church frequently and I read my sacred texts at least a week or that kind of thing. Yeah. So maybe that could be helpful, because I really would love to see the breakdown by like how often people are going to church and whether or not they actually believe their Bible or what, but even then there's some subcategories there.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, would the same thing apply to like Republican? I mean, like Josh is a Republican, but he's not, that kind of Republican.
Yeah, sure. Right.
I think I'm a Republican, dude. I think I'm a Republican. I voted for Republican senator and, for that, but I voted for Chase Oliver and I disappointed, dude. It didn't get too many. He was behind Jill Stein and RFK.
Yeah, a lot of people voted Sonski. Sonski was the American Solidarity Party.
Oh,
yeah. He wasn't on he wasn't on like most state ballots, but he was on a lot of ballots as kind of Christian alternative to Trump or Harris that a lot of I think evangelicals were supporting. I think I think Republican. Unfortunately, I think if you had asked me in 2016, we should have different questions between kind of like MAGA Republicans and traditional Republicans, like establishment Republicans. Now, after 2020, after what we just witnessed, I mean, the Venn diagram again is kind of like becoming a circle. It's not MAGA owns the Republican Party. I mean, like it is. Not saying that all Republicans are Trumpian or how you want to adjective or like kind of make that, but but they are going to have to deal with that, right? And they all have to, if they're not going to get primaried out of office, like in Oklahoma, no Democrat is really going to win high office. You're not going to win the governor. You're not going to win president here. You could win we have Democrats who are like state senators and House of Reps and judges. Based on districts, but you just are not going to be able to run for senator, like our national senator, our national House rep, or whatever as a Democrat. So the goal there in those elections is to primary your opponent, to paint your opponent as a rhino and to go as hard right as possible and say, I'm the most MAGA Republican you could possibly be. And so that's who we end up electing. And so every Republican now has to contend with that reality in a red state. Is if you are going to get the Republican vote, you have to go as close to Trump as possible in your rhetoric and positioning. And so with that, like he ends up dominating the party, and his victory the other day, I think is going to, even though, again, I think that was largely an economic victory, I think it's going to fan the fuel for that kind of Christian nationalist rhetoric in politics. It certainly will in Oklahoma and other red states that have just no real opposition to speak of.
So this is all like really, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the whole picture, right? So we have this research that you've done that's basically like, hey, the stronger you lean Christian nationalism, the more comfortable you are with authoritarian uses of power and essentially taking the gloves off. There no's limit. We have a Supreme Court decision that we have gone to in depth on this show that essentially says presidents have immunity for anything that they do, with no real clear definition as to what official power, official acts are. And you have these trends where now you have a guy who's in his second term. You could think of lame duck, but I don't think he'll ever be a lame duck in that sense. I think he will, continue to, get as much support for himself as he can. That's just my prediction. I don't know the guy and whatever. And you get Trump saying a lot of things. He says a lot of rhetoric. He says, I didn't know, what did he say about Project 2025? I've never heard of it. I have no, and then he said, I some of the stuff's good, some of the stuff's bad, but he said he never heard of it. So I'm not sure how, anyway, whatever. It's like contradiction within the same tweet, but I guess we're used to that by now. Right. But it's like, you have him saying all this rhetoric, and I hear people say to me, listen, people that voted for him that I love and deeply respect, and I don't have anything against that. I think I need to make that clear just on this podcast. Like, I don't have anything against anybody who's voted for Trump. Like, I don't, some of the people I love most have voted for Trump, and I respect that decision. And in many ways, I understand that decision, though I personally disagreed. Like, I couldn't do that myself. Right. But how do we, like, a lot of my friends will say, hey, it's just rhetoric, dude. The guy just says things. He just runs his mouth. Like, all these people are freaking out. All these liberals are crying, and I'm laughing at their TikToks where they're screaming and crying and all this stuff. And it's just ridiculous. They're acting like babies. What's going on here? He's just a president like anyone else. Do you either help me, either respond to that with something that's like, hey, no, I think this is why you should be concerned.
Right.
So, go ahead. I've given enough.
So Trump has successfully, I think I think Trump from the beginning, because he was a populist candidate. When I say populist, I mean he was like, in his rhetoric, he was like anti-elite. We're going to drain the swamp. Washington's broken. We're going to get all the corruption out. So he was a populist, meaning like the people saw him as the answer to all these elites that they hate, the academic elites, the uppity liberal leftist elites who've been calling us racists for years, and we're just going to elect Trump, and he's going to go in there like a bull in the china shop. And they love his kind of brashness and his ability to just kind of tell it like it is. Even though it's bold-faced lies, it still is kind of like seems authentic, right? Because it's like unsophisticated, just, shoot from the hip. And it's all off the cuff for Trump. I mean, he just goes out there and riffs, right? So like it's that kind of thing. But it also has the consequence, the positive way to look at this. And these people, I think the people that like that Trump rhetoric would say that he has successfully shifted the Overton window. And when I say Overton window, I mean, for the podcast listeners who don't know what that is, the Overton window is the window of what is culturally acceptable to say in public, right? Like, or is politically acceptable to say. So previously, it might have not been appropriate or acceptable. It might have gotten you ended your political career to say the kinds of things that Trump says in public. But now he's shifted that Overton window to where everything is on the table. You can say anything you want. And there's basically no consequence to anything that sounds xenophobic or racist or anti-Muslim or something against women or whatever. Nothing will end your political career. Now, people who hate political correctness probably love that, and they think that's a really good thing. At the same time, I think you could look at that really, I look at that as in some ways, I think you could see it positively, but I think on the whole, it also has really negative consequences because I think it erases some, I think, really important norms of how we treat fellow citizens, that we don't dehumanize political opponents, for example. Like, you can't imagine a political candidate for president calling half of Americans vermin or rats or snakes or any kind of, comparing them to any kind of, that's atrocity kind of language, right? Like, that's how those things happen, is you dehumanize your political opponents and you call them trash or whatever. And then it's just a few years from that to let's round them up, and let's start carting them away. So I think violating those kinds of presidential norms of how you treat people and talk about citizens and, talk with a level of appropriateness that people respect the office. I think that's important. And I think that makes American politics uglier when it gets rid of that. I mean, study after study after study, and this is a common finding in political science, is elite rhetoric matters. Like the rhetoric of our politicians matters. How
That's
our
really
senators, not just Trump, but like how our senators and our House reps talk about the out of party candidate. I mean, one of these famous things that you can't imagine seeing right now is you've probably all seen this video when John McCain was running against Obama in 2008, and some lady at this town hall that John McCain was doing called Barack Obama a Muslim and a terrorist, and John McCain said like, hey, that's not true. It's not. Like, he actually corrected the woman and just like, look, he's an American citizen. I disagree with politically, but that's just not true. I mean, that's an amazing like piece of like, look, tone down the rhetoric. Let's turn the heat down a few notches, and let's just remember we disagree politically, but we got to get together and cooperate. I think Trump's kind of rhetoric of us versus them, not just partisan rhetoric, but really, we're going to round up people, or we're going to mass deportations, or Muslims are all like this, or, I just don't think that's just rhetoric. I think that's a kind of a rhetoric that is corrupting. And certainly if this is a biblical Christian who's talking, that is not found in scripture, that we just kind of let whatever fly, whether it's hurtful to people or say whatever we want. That's not found in Ephesians, right? Like, it's not found in certainly not found in the teachings that Paul would have about the fruit of the Spirit and the way we're supposed to treat people. Certainly not in the way that Jesus would have treated people, unless you want to take, which they do. I think Christian nationalists love little parts of the Gospels where they can selectively say, like, Jesus called this lady a dog, or, look, Jesus called the Pharisees a brood of vipers, so that means it's cool. It's now fair game to like call people names and mock them or degrade them.
It's like Jesus flipped tables, so I can storm a Capitol.
Yeah, so I can hit people, right? Like, and I can get whips together and like drive out people I don't like. So it's that kind of. I think Trump represents not just an Overton window shift. I think he represents a degradation of norms that I think are actually pretty important for keeping our politics safe, and to keep our democracy the envy of the world. I mean, I think like if you look around the world right now, you're not going to, other than Hungary and Russia, you're not going to see headlines on those newspapers that were like, Americans got it right again. Good for them. Like they're all going to be gloom and doom, because it's like, I can't believe America has come to this. Like, I can't believe they actually did it. It's an international embarrassment. And it's not because of economic policies, it's because of what Trump presents about, being basically a remorseless, consequence free politician who can say and do whatever he wants to forever. I mean, it's pretty astonishing, actually.
Yeah, it really is. And I whoever listens to this, and this will be a great clip to put out. I mean, what you just said was worth its weight in gold. Like, that is such a good understanding of, hey, let's remember, like, it's not okay to just say these things and use your platform to say the kinds of things that are being said. That's very destructive, and even more so. Like, he's not just hanging out, having wine and a cigar with his buddies talking. He's on a platform addressing millions of people.
Right.
It just really, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I want to maybe kind of change the tone a little bit, and ask you about your newest book, Religion for Realists. So tell us what it's about.
Yeah, so Religion for Realists is really an argument. It's to three groups of people. For maybe that wasn't the best idea to try to write to three audiences, but I tried to pull it off. So first, I'm arguing that the scientific study of religion can actually help us understand religion a lot, because it helps us understand human behavior a lot. And some of the things that we're learning about how religion actually works, I think, can help us shift a little bit of a misunderstanding that we have, primarily because of what I call the dominant Anglo-Protestant culture. So Anglo-Protestant culture, what I mean by that is, and I don't mean that like negatively, I'm a part of that Anglo-Protestant culture, but part of this is that the primary driver, one misconception is the primary driver of religious behavior or political behavior or anything is belief rather than identity. and norms we have within a community. That the primary reason that religious groups grow or decline is whether or not their ideas are really good. In reality, it's actually more about the population dynamics, like immigration and birth rates and those kinds of things, which may sound weird to some, but that's just true. Historically, it always has been. And then lastly, that if we are really motivated and really organized, you and I can by ourselves affect massive social change. That may be true to some limited extent, but a lot of the religious dynamics that we see in the world right now are because of changes in social structure, broad economic changes, broad political changes, global technological changes that we don't really have a whole lot that we can do about. Now, we can do stuff within that, but these are all changes that are affecting us. And so I argue in the book, in the first few chapters, that, and I show this is, I'm a social scientist, so there's lots of data here to back this up. But I basically show that, oftentimes our theology, what we say that we believe and that drives our thinking on various things, once we poke a little bit into that, we find that it's very downstream of a lot of group identity concerns. So let me give you an example of that. So we asked Americans right before the 2020 election how much they agreed with the statement that God chooses the president. And of course, we found that evangelicals very much so believe that. And that's before the election 2020. Trump was the president. So they very much so were yes, God chooses the president. Well, we wanted to see what they said after Trump lost. And so we asked those same evangelicals that same question 4 months later. So this is the same people. And basically about half said God chooses the president. But it wasn't just all evangelicals. It was only evangelical Republicans. So what happened? They literally changed their theology about God and the president. The only thing that happened was their boy lost, right? That their candidate lost. And so that required them to change their theology. Now, anybody who knows the history of race and religion in the United States knows that theology can be manipulated and was historically manipulated in all kinds of ways to justify the extermination of Native Americans, the enslavement of Black Americans, the subjugation of women, the oppression of all these kinds of groups. So we already know that group interests can drive the twisting of theology. And I'm just making the argument that that actually happens a lot. We actually kind of build our theology on the basis of group norms. Now, the second part of that is why do religious groups grow and decline? Well, a lot of it is because of the ability of certain groups to maintain high fertility rates longer than other groups and immigration flows. So why have Catholics stayed constant across the last 50 years of the United States? That doesn't make a lot of sense when you see that white Catholics have been abandoning the faith for a while. Well, what explains that is the inflows of Hispanic Catholics that have been coming in for a few decades. And so what it does is it gives the impression that Catholics have stayed at the exact same number, while white Catholics have been declining and Hispanic Catholics have been rising. What explains why mainline Protestants have been declining for the last 50, 60 years, while evangelical Protestants have stayed the same or grown? It's not because one group has necessarily better ideas. You can say that they do or don't. But it's primarily, and we actually have evidence to show this, it's primarily because mainline Protestants were made of upper class people who are very educated and career driven. And those people tend to have fewer babies, and they had fewer and fewer babies, and evangelicals had lots of babies, and they grew just like Mormons grew, and just like the Amish grew, and just like Jehovah's Witnesses grow, and just like Muslims are growing around the world right now, and just like Christians in Africa are growing. It's about population dynamics. So, and then the last part is I talk about what explains secularization worldwide, like why Americans are doing that. Is it because really people are tired of Jesus and rejecting the ideas? Or is it because there's lots of things going on? The state and the market have crowded out a lot of the things that the churches used to do. So where we no longer have the church filling certain roles like education, like our dating. We don't date at church anymore. We date on an app, right? We don't go to our pastors for counsel anymore. We go to professional counselors who have degrees in psychology. It's all these things that make us less detached from religion personally. So these are just kind of examples, but the book is mostly about why the scientific study of religion can actually help us understand how religion works in the United States better than we would without it.
I love that. That is so fascinating. We got to get Okay, is it already out, or is
Oh
it?
yeah, it came out just late or mid-October. Yeah.
Okay, that's great, man. I'm gonna have to pick up a copy. That sounds amazing. I did have a question, and then I'm gonna just ask some practical things to close us out. Um, why is this important now? Why is the message? Do you feel like what compelled you to feel like you needed to write about this now and
Yeah,
that beyond just the interested in it? It's super
sure.
interesting,
Um,
but is there more?
yeah, absolutely. So I wrote this book now. The original title. So the book is called "Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion." Originally, it was called. The subtitle was "Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion Now More Than Ever." And so I really mean like
Nice.
this was written I think because what I argue in the book, in every chapter I show this, I end each chapter with an argument for this, is that authoritarian ethno-nationalists around the world actually already understand religion for realists. They already understand how religion works because they know they don't care. Like Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin, they don't care about what people believe, but they care about identity. So they want to shore up like Christian identity in their nations against immigrants or the outsiders or the bad guys. It's identitarian, right? Like it is about identity fully. They understand that. They understand that like who cares what ideas people have? We care about population growth. We don't want immigrants. We want to increase fertility rates. We want to do all those kinds of things, and that's how they're trying to grow their own populations and manipulate those dynamics. And they also know that people and how they behave and believe are downstream of a lot of structural legal kinds of things that they can do. They can organize their societies in such a way to persecute certain groups or to favor other groups. And so the argument for why we need a religion for realists, why we need to understand how this works, is because authoritarian populists around the world, and I think including in the United States, are already working this game plan because they already know how this works. They don't really, they're not, they're not, they're not distracted by any kind of Anglo-Protestant tradition of like emphasizing beliefs or doctrines or those kinds of things. They just know this is what works. And when I kind of play on people's identities and by getting them fearful and angry, or when I try to mess with, like, I don't want those bad people in here. So I'm not going to try to convince them. I'm going to just force them out. I'm going to keep immigrants out. I'm going to keep Muslims out. I'm going to try to suppress those groups. And I'm going to do it legally with social structure. I think the book is important because I think it reveals the game plan that's actually already underway on the authoritarian far right around the world and in the United States.
Man, that's really good, and I think that it's an argument that needs to be heard. And thanks for writing on it and doing all the work and research
Sure.
that was needed. I mean, man, this message is so important, and it's like I I can't stand when people they just cut something out and dismiss it offhand because they don't like it, because it doesn't fit with because they don't feel good about it. Like literally,
Right.
they don't like it, meaning they don't feel positive feelings when they
Right.
hear it.
Yeah.
And it's like, we have got to get past that. And I'm
Yeah.
afraid we won't, but I'm also, I'm hopeful that we will. What gives you hope for the future? And then how can people get a hold of you or follow your work?
Yeah. So what gives me hope for the future? I think I'm a Christian, so I think Jesus gives me hope for the future. I think my the fact that we have local communities and that no matter what is happening nationally, I mean, I think people ought to really keep this in mind. Like national politics are only a piece of like what happens politically in the United States, and politics and like our activity in the community is happening at all levels. And there's a huge capacity for like local communities and even state governments to resist things that they don't like. Um, our state has been doing that against Joe Biden for a long time, right? Like into resisting everything that and so if states or local communities or schools districts or those kinds of things say that they don't like something going on at the national level, there's actually a lot more latitude than people realize to say, like, we're not going to do that. Like, that's something that we're not going to be part of. And you can be a part of that. If there's I don't mean resistance in some kind of like militant way, but I just mean like in a way that you feel like if a Trump administration and a MAGA Congress are passing legislation and doing things that you feel like you don't like and are in violation of the values that you hold, you actually have a lot more latitude than you realize to push back against those kinds of things and to challenge that. Whatever people are fearful of, that Project 2025 or Trump has promised to do, or those kinds of things, I think none of those things have happened yet. So I see zero reason why people just need to kind of roll over and die and feel like this is it. So what was it all for? And say goodbye to democracy or whatever. Like I just feel like there's, I mean, if I don't mean to be preachy here, but like, man, civil rights took a long time, and that was a long history of people getting their butts kicked and losing a lot right before they won. And so like I'm you don't lose one election and just kind of say that was the end of democracy. I guess we're a fascist nation now. Like I think you just kind of say, what do you do? How do you move forward? And I'm tremendously kind of like empowered by that, and I'm ready to get to work. And for me, that when I say work, I mean like work helping people, work living out my values and doing the kind of work I think matters. So, our agency to kind of really still be able to do things and accomplish good, I think that gives me hope that can happen.
I love that. How can people follow your work and
so
get a hold of you? If
sure. Email address is on my department website, but follow me at Prof. Sam Perry on Twitter, and that's the only social media platform until Musk destroys it or it just burns to the ground. I'll be there. Yeah.
Well, fortunately for us, he will be working in the White House, so he probably won't.
Yeah.
Fortunately for X, huh?
Yeah. Fortunately for X. Yeah, that's right. Probably going to do pretty well now.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. It's been really great to have you on the show again and talk about all this stuff.
Oh man, my privilege, guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and listeners, thanks, guys, for joining us. Also, make sure you like and subscribe. We forgot to say that, Will, at the beginning. We always forget, but it's very important so we can keep this work going, so we can be a part of the solution that Dr. Perry is talking about. We want you guys to pick up his book, Religion for Realists, why we need all the scientific study, why we all need the scientific study of religion. I apologize. Make sure you guys pick that up wherever books are sold. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Take care, guys.